Welcome back to the channel, Black is One, where the agenda is to elevate the consciousness of the black race so we can unite, build, and prosper. I know it has been a while since I haven't posted any videos. I had to take a break to sort out some personal stuff. I'm still not finished with what I'm doing, but when I see what is going on in Africa, I said to myself, I have to come and make even a short video to give you an update on the continent. Africa is in the middle of a revolution, people. There's a serious political standoff between France and some of its former colonies in Africa, and I haven't seen anything about it on any news network in Jamaica. No TVJ, no CVM, but like they say, the revolution will not be televised. And I must tell you that I am bubbling with excitement, because this time, for a change, the news is not bad. What is happening in Africa is good news, not just for Africa, but for black people all over the world. So you might be asking, what am I talking about? Now, several African leaders have been rising up who are reclaiming their countries from French domination. But in this video, I'm going to only give you an update on just one: Niger. And before I get into it, let me give you some context. Remember during the World Cup when I was doing a series of videos on some of the countries in the World Cup, exploring how some of these countries treated black people and Africa historically? In that series, I did a video on France, in which I was making the point that France was one of the European countries that treated black people the worst. Worst with a T. The worst in all of history, arguably. Remember that video? You see, unlike other colonial oppressors like Britain and Portugal, the Belgium, Italy, Spain, and so on, who left Africa after their colonies gained independence, France never left. So Africa, especially the former French colonies, remained a looting ground for France, even in 2023. Well, finally France has been coming under pressure in Africa. Africans have started to say no to France meddling in their politics, destabilizing their country, and looting their resources. Guinea has said no. So has Mali and Burkina Faso. Now the latest country to stand up to the French is Niger. This is a country in West Africa that France colonized in the 1920s and gave them a fake independence in 1960. I say the independence was fake because even though they quote-unquote gained independence, it was still not a full independence. They were independent on paper, but in reality, France still maintained control. A lot of conditions still applied. They literally had to sign a contract called the Pact for the Continuation of Colonization. Literally. The word pact means a contract or a treaty. So they literally signed a contract or a treaty called Contract for the Continuation of Colonization. Imagine that. Anyway, some of the conditions of their quote-unquote independence was that they had to give France, number one, the right to invade. I get to understand that even though Niger was said to be independent, they had to agree that France had the right to invade their country militarily if the government makes any decision that doesn't suit the interests of France. The second condition was that France should get exclusive rights to all government contracts. So all government contracts had to be offered to France or French companies first. Only if France doesn't want that contract can the government give it to another country or another company. Condition number 3 is that their national currency must be the CFA franc, a currency that France printed. Not the Niger dollar, but the CFA franc. So they were not allowed to have their own currency, nor were they to use the real French currency that France uses, which is the franc, but rather a colonial currency called the CFA franc, printed in France. Number 4. Now listen to this one. The government in Niger, I understand, was not allowed to keep all its money in Africa. They had to deposit a certain amount of their net international reserve in the French treasury in France. And if they wanted any of that money to use, they had to apply for it as a loan to be repaid with interest. So essentially, they had to borrow their own money. You know? Another condition in the independence contract, the colonial continuation contract, number 5, is that France had to train Niger's military. Nobody else or else. Number 6, France had the right to all minerals mined in the country. Now, Niger produced gold, silver, salt, tin, limestone, gypsum, and the main one that is causing the problem, uranium. This is the mineral that France uses to power its nuclear reactors to produce electricity for its citizens. 20% of the uranium that powers France comes from Niger. This allows the entire French population, 100%, to have access to electricity. However, in Niger, where the uranium comes from, out of every 100 citizens, only 14 has access to electricity. You know, the world's third or fourth largest supplier of uranium only has 14% electricity coverage. Imagine that. And remember now that this colonial contract doesn't apply to Niger alone. It applied to all former French colonies in West Africa. And the clauses that I've listed here are not all the clauses. This is just a snippet of the entire document. There are others, but you get the point. You see, over the last 60 years, France has had a free ride, so to speak, to quote-unquote legally extract all the resources from these countries by installing puppet governments. In Jamaica, we call them sellout government. You know, these are politicians who will collect money to do their master's bidding and neglect the needs of the ordinary citizen and the needs of the country. And if any leader were to rise up that wanted to do good for his people, France will find a way to get him out of the picture and put in someone that will do their bidding, that will look out for the interest of France. Well, all this came to a bitter end, bitter for France that is, on July 26, 2003, when the Nigerian military, the army, took over the country and put out France and its puppet president, a man by the name of Mohamed Bazoum. And now the new leaders of the country are seeking to assert their true independence. Since the military take over the country, they have revoked all military agreements with France. They have banned French radio stations and TV stations from broadcasting in the country. They have ordered the French ambassador and officials to leave the country. He was to leave in 48 hours. However, for over 3 weeks, on the instruction of French President Emmanuel Macron, he refused to leave. I think they were trying to frustrate the Nigerian government to the point where they would use force to remove him. And if the Nigerian had done that, it would have given France and NATO a reason to invade them and destroy the country like they did to Gaddafi in Libya. But the Nigerians would not give France that excuse. They knew France had a trick up its sleeve. So instead of using military force to get the ambassador out of the country, the government cut off his water supply, cut off his food supply and his electricity, and restrict him from leaving out of the embassy until France bowed to pressure and told him to come home basically. The new government has also asked the French to pull out their troops from the country. Over 1,500 French soldiers were stationed in the capital, claiming to assist the Nigerians with fighting terrorists. However, the Nigerians themselves are complaining that after 25 years of their presence in the country, terrorism has actually increased, not decreased. They also believe that instead of fighting terrorists, French soldiers are actually aiding terrorists to destabilize the country so they, France, can steal the country's resources. They also believe that since France claimed that they are in the country to fight terrorists, continued quote-unquote terrorist activities justify the presence of the French military in the country. So France has no interest in stopping terrorism, because if terrorism were to end, they would no longer be needed in the country, and they don't want to leave the country. So it's in the interest of France that terrorism continues. And I tend to believe the people. But whatever the truth is, the new government has asked French troops to leave his country. But they too, like the French ambassador, got instruction from their president Emmanuel Macron not to leave. This action to me is also a kind of provocation. They want the government to use force to remove them so France can have an excuse to start a war. But the Nigerians were smart. They did not play into the hands of France. They simply restricted the 1,500 French soldiers from leaving their base. They were not permitted to go anywhere else in the country. What they also did was that the citizens staged days of peaceful protests in front of the military base until the French relented and decided to leave the country. They said that they will start pulling out their troops, and by December of this year, all their military personnel and military hardware should be off Nigerian soil. Interesting times in Africa, people. And like I said, when Captain Ibrahim Traore and his soldiers in Burkina Faso took over the government from French puppets in September of last year, I don't necessarily agree with armies taking over countries, strictly speaking. You know, I don't know what these new leaders will do in the future, but for now, they have my support because they have the support of their people and they are standing up on their people's behalf. They are willing to stand up against 100 years of oppression and exploitation by France. And I wish them all the best, you know. In the meantime, I invite you to get some information. Keep your ears on the ground. Go on YouTube and TikTok and find out what is going on in the motherland. I say YouTube and TikTok because I don't really watch mainstream media very much these days, especially the BBC and CNN and such. I find them to be very biased and very lie when it comes to reporting on Africa or anything that has to do with black people in general. But just saying, find out what is going on with your cousins and brothers and sisters and aunties and uncles in Africa. The mainstream media will not tell you. They want to keep you occupied with what is happening to Trump and Joe Biden. That has very little to do with black people and their future for the next 100 years. I'm inviting you to take an interest in what is going on. I am sure that some people never even knew that there was a country in Africa called Niger. You're familiar with Nigeria, but Niger kind of slip under the radar. The only thing these news stations will tell you about Africa are the negatives. There's a lot going on in Africa right now, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. The reason why I'm putting out this update is that I am hoping that this news will uplift the spirit of the black man. What is happening in Niger is not just a victory for Niger or Africa. It is also a victory for all black people everywhere. In this side of the world, the narratives around Africa and black people has always been us being on the receiving end of centuries of victimization. But what is happening in Africa now is changing that narrative. The new narrative is that of black resistance, African resistance. And our enemies are not happy. There will be pushback, but we'll keep the fire burning and we'll keep the drums beating. Stay tuned. Black is one. Live the revolution.